should ask me to introduce our two distinguished speakers, I felt really elated and quite proud, which then led me to reflect a little on exactly why I felt this way. Besides the fact that our speakers answered to proper names that connote impressive contributions in the history of philosophy, it was a role of host that I was asked to play. The host that opens the door, greets and welcomes the arrival of guests, that gladdened me so much. It has been given to me to receive our guest speakers today, receive from them the gift of hospitality, for indeed they do us all a great honor by being here. And to cite some of their well-known accomplishments, I think, is perhaps the only way in which we can express some gratitude at the moment. So without further ado, I welcome Professors Ed Casey and David Wood. Professor Casey is our first speaker, and he's Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at SUNY Stony Brook. For now over a few decades, his has been the leading voice in the history of philosophy, particularly phenomenology, aesthetics, and psychoanalytic theory. He's perhaps most avidly read for his inquiries into the philosophy of space and place, landscape painting, and maps as modes of representation, ethics, and the other, feeling and emotion, philosophy of perception, the nature of edges, etc. It's a fascinating corpus. He's indeed the author, he's the author and editor of, to date, over, I think I counted over a dozen books. And such classic works as Remembering a Phenomenological Study, Getting Back into Place, Toward a Renewed Understanding of the Place World, and The World on Edge, which is in preparation at the moment, etc. It would take me all afternoon to read the titles of all of his works. I should just say, in concluding, that he's also the author of over 100 articles in various fields of his undisputed expertise. So, Professor Casey.
Well, thank you for that much too generous introduction. I feel like I am indeed the guest on this occasion. And thanks to Richard for inviting me. And thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning. If it's any consolation, I'll have you know that it was I who insisted that we start at 11 o'clock, not at 9 or 10 o'clock, starting time. So, I think I was prophetic. It's a good thing because I got in last night from the West Coast at 2:30, got to sleep about 4:30, so it's just as well that we're starting a little on the late side. This paper is entitled Strangers at the Edge of Hospitality. So it's pièce d'occasion. I wrote it for this occasion and for no other. It will probably know no other fate. It's for all of you and all of us to ponder. It's a limited, focused study, which is in some sense phenomenological, I guess, some extended sense of phenomenology, and I think will usefully contrast with David Wood's paper you're about to hear, which goes from phenomenology really into ontology. So we're in a sequence that repeats the history of continental philosophy itself without even intending to do this. That may have been Richard's plan, I'm not sure. Strangers at the edge. Well, where else would they be? The edge is their place, or rather their non-place, since the edge is no place to be, no place to be comfortable, to be identified, to have the status of a citizen. Yet paradoxically, the edge is also where strangers are received. It is where hospitality happens. It is the non-place where the opening of hospitable place, a place called home, country, people, in short, archetypal place itself, emerges, and where, deepened and prolonged, such place comes to stay, to last as the reliable scene and setting of hospitality. As hospitality itself, I shall suggest, considering that there is no hospitality in an edgeless place like the middle of the desert. Hospitality at the edge, hospitality on the edge, hospitality as edge. That's where I want to go this morning. Stranger's Gate. These words are chiseled in red sandstone on the wall next to an entrance to the west side of Central Park on 105th Street, close to where I now live. Every major gate to Central Park has its own name. Other names, some 12 in all by my count, are more predictable and reassuring, names such as Citizens Gate and Warriors Gate. But Stranger's Gate is enigmatic. The first time I saw it walking briskly by, I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it in disbelief. I wondered what it was meant to mean when it was constructed in the late 19th century. I still do not know. My best guess is that it refers to all who come to New York as foreigners, as immigrants especially, but also increasingly as tourists and visitors. Any non-native is in effect a stranger, above all in this city with its outsized buildings and high population density, its brazen wealth chock-a-block with unalleviated poverty. Manhattan with its multilingualism and intense energies. No one feels entirely at home in New York, not even native New Yorkers, whoever these may be. Only Aboriginal Native Americans could rightly declare this place as home, but they are present only as absent, nameless, not even a memory at this late historical point, only bones encountered by chance as sewer lines are newly dug. Historians of the city may refer to them with accuracy and authority, but the rest of us, latecomers, have not the slightest clue. The most that residents of the city know now is that waves of immigrants have swept through the city from the 17th century to the present, the Dutch and the British, some Germans and French, African Americans and Irish, who, together, lived in shanty towns in Central Park when it was nothing but an open plain north of the heart of the city. Then tides of Eastern Europeans in the late 19th century, many Southerners and Midwesterners in the early 20th century, thousands of Chinese and fewer Japanese, and more recently, economic and political refugees from Central America, especially Mexico. All of these were strangers initially, and many remain so, especially those who find employment only by doing the most menial of tasks. It is most often undocumented Mexicans who are bussing tables and washing dishes these days in New York restaurants. Just look around. All of these peoples came as strangers in the night, and those who stayed became strangers in the day. As if to reflect this continual strangerhood, Stranger's Gate is open all day and all night. All these strangers are odd fits, if not actual misfits, in everyday reality, never quite fitting in. And this is the way I would describe myself, an Irish, Swiss, Kansan, transplanted to New York, even though I've lived there for some time now and am a salaried servant of the state. We are strangers in the land, foreigners in the city, reminding us that stranger in its French root as l'étranger means quite literally someone from another country, another city, thus estranged from somewhere else, some other place. To come from another place is to come from abroad, where the broad in abroad resonates with the minimal breadth that any place requires. Flat, the ultimate etymon of place itself, means flat and open. To be a stranger or foreigner is to come from elsewhere, another where than that which is habitual or familiar, from d'ailleurs, as the French also say, a word in which we hear the allos of other, of Greek allos, that is equally present in the English word alien, which becomes more of an accusation these days than a description. An alien worker, we say, with barely concealed suspicion, if not outright contempt, or foreign alien, in a wholly redundant expression that ensures that the sharp edge of insinuation turns twice in the flesh of those at which this epithet is flung. But what of the gate is Stranger's Gate? If strangers come from abroad, foreign land, an open place, to come to another land, they must enter through certain gates, often stringent in their requirements for passage. Straight is the gate and narrow is the way. At stake here are not just the pearly gates of heaven or the fiercely guarded gates of hell. To be from abroad, être de l'étranger, is to move from the breadth and history of one's place of origin, even if its people have been repressed and displaced by tyrannical political regimes, into a new place where one must pass muster in order to enter. One must submit to the protocol, the rite de passage, of the tight gates of immigration control to start with. But even if this is successfully negotiated, the demanding gates of a new culture, a new language, a new people, with their peculiar customs and mores, disciplines and rituals, these all call for assimilation. They are challenging. In short, the stranger as foreigner must pass through something that has a sufficiently sturdy constitution to persist over time and to resist, by its sheer materiality or dense historicity, any merely facile passage. A physical gate is emblematic of this situation. It can be opened and closed at specific times and under certain precise conditions, which are laid down by the authority of the state and reinforced by delegated representatives of the government, customs officials, police, border guards, and so on. In this respect, Stranger's Gate in Central Park is anomalous, if not outright oxymoronic. Although it is a gate, it has no gated door that can be closed and locked, nor is it ever guarded, nor, so far as I know, is it regulated by any pre-existing laws of the city or state. It is in effect an ungated gate, an always open gate. But all gates, stringent or relaxed, possess one very basic trait. They must be, or at least have, edges. Edges give them definition and structure. Without them, gates would be so indeterminate as not to count as gates at all. In virtually every case, gates are edges of public spaces such as lots and parks, office buildings and residences, indeed, whole residential complexes, so-called gated communities. Gates occur at the outer limits of these spaces. But they are also, in each case, the endpoints of physical objects and laid out places. They mark the outermost limits of their surfaces. Indeed, their primary function, gates, is to provide openings in the surfaces of places and things alike. This is true no matter how restricted they may be, how heavily guarded, how difficult of passage, or discouraging of entry. The gate to Kafka's castle, forever barred from passage, is a break in the surface of the castle, nevertheless, even if it remains permanently closed. Otherwise, it would not be a gate at all. Whatever their particular coefficient of adversity may be, gates are made to open under certain circumstances, however remotely attainable, to provide an opening in the surface of that to which they are attached. Gates, then, are edges of places and things that offer passage. They are porous in principle. To this extent, they act as that kind of edge that these days I like to call boundaries. That is, edges that allow for traversal across them in various modes of two-way traffic. When gates are parts of walls, however, they are features of what I designate as borders, which are delimitable and continuous edges that serve to close off or seal a nation or city, as in the is the phrase the U.S.-Mexico border that is otherwise known as La Frontera. A gate and a wall such as that built recently at Nogales, Laredo, or Tijuana is thus a hybrid edge. It is a boundary in a border, a boundary-like break in an otherwise unbroken border. In the case of La Frontera, such gates are called euphemistically checkpoints, which are the particular sites for immigration and drug control through which one can walk or drive, that is, if one passes inspection, and has the proper papers to show. Stranger's Gate, in contrast with such checkpoints, is an always open edge whose very lack of formal, state-sanctioned control symbolizes nothing short of saying, in effect, welcome, come on in, enter freely, and without peril. This gate is thus an edge that offers unchecked admission to anyone who wishes to walk through it. It is the very converse of the felt lack of welcome that is so graphically evident and bodily felt at La Frontera checkpoints, which serve more as obstacles than as facilitations to passage. The long lines of waiting cars, especially those coming from the south, is a concrete image of this unwelcoming situation. Still more so is the anxious suffering felt in the bodies of the migrants who seek to find ways over or around the formidable wall that was first constructed as part of the aptly named Operation Gatekeeper, 1995, part of NAFTA. In these opening ruminations, we are circling around a basic circumstance that this morning I shall call the edge of hospitality. I mean this in several basic senses. As the limit of hospitality, where it runs out, as the edge at which hospitality actually happens, whether this be a gate or a door, and hospitality as edge, as a liminal phenomenon, a matter of thresholds in human sociality, over and through which significant exchanges and interchanges, transmissions and trespasses transpire, or by the same token are excluded as when they are forbidden. I also mean the way in which hospitality doesn't just take place, but gives place, offers space of a special sort. And let me now, in this middle region of the paper, say something about each of these four factors. First, the limit of hospitality. When hospitality is conditional, it becomes the kind of thing that may not happen in a given circumstance. Each of us has experienced this. We come to the door, hoping to be greeted, but are instead turned away abruptly. The door, we say, is slammed in our face. In this case, we have not met even the minimal criteria for admission, much less welcome. Failing to meet conditions of acceptability, we are personae non grata. We lack the proper appearance. We have the wrong skin color, or we don't have a recognizable name. We do not meet the minimal conditions for social or legal propriety. We're lacking in the proprius, the right ownness or identity. With the result that we are not accepted by the person who opens the door. He or she does not recognize us as one of their own. So we are disowned at this fragile initiatory moment. The zero limit of hospitality is reached at a glance. We are deemed unworthy to merit admission, to step through the door, where limit signifies the exact condition that has to be met for a stranger to be admitted. This is why we say that a situation like that of Stranger's Gate in Central Park offers unlimited hospitality. No conditions are observed, no strictures are invoked, no sanctions are levied. Secondly, hospitality at the edge. It's a striking fact that hospitality as an event occurs at or on an edge, always, irremissibly. There is no hospitality in open air, just as there is no hospitality in general. Doubtless this is why Derrida insists that even what he calls absolute or unconditional hospitality has a conditional aspect in terms of the particular laws and terms by which it is enacted. I cite Derrida from the Seminar of Hospitality. Quote, the unconditional law of hospitality needs the conditional laws. It requires them. This demand is constitutive of hospitality itself. Now, these laws or conditions are not only legal or customary, they reflect the requirement that events of hospitality occur in circumstances of edge. By this I mean, primarily, spatial edges, those that obtain at the door, at the gate, on the border. Also at stake, however, are bodily edges. Two or more bodies always meet in acts of hospitality, whether those of host and guest, border guard and immigrant, or other bodies. But these bodily edges meet only within the terms provided by the first kind of edge, conjoining at the spatial edges of doorways and other such openings. Further, and at the same time, cultural edges obtain. There has to be an edge of difference in history or language or tradition for hospitality to be an issue. Two people who share entirely a given cultural matrix do not need to offer hospitable gestures to each other, or if they do, they are pro forma, wholly expected and thus perfunctory, however pleasurable and welcome they may happen to be. All such edges, spatial and bodily and cultural, enact what every edge effects. They bring together and they separate, both at once, albeit each at its own level and in its own way. Here is the bivalent basis of all hospitality, which must involve some modicum of each if it is to happen at all, bringing together, separating. When there's nothing but separation, we have reached the limit of hospitality, its null point. When there is nothing but fusion, nothing has been accomplished. There has been no act or event of hospitality. Nothing has happened that is not already the case, as in the meeting of two culturally homogeneous beings, like two buddies who slap each other on the back symmetrically and simultaneously. Otherwise put, hospitalizing, as I like to call it, as separative/conjunctive, enacts reciprocal but asymmetrical relationships between beings who possess at least a minimal diversity with respect to each other, who are strangers to each other in some significant respects. For the state of strangerhood is not confined to those we habitually designate as strangers, foreigners, immigrants, like those who are unknown, and so on. In the event of hospitality, all parties are strange to each other in significant ways. When the door opens, the owner of the house appears just as strange to the would-be entrant as the latter to the former. In the civil confrontation, we witness the reciprocity of host and guest in the very midst of asymmetrical strangeness. We could call them incongruent counterparts, to adapt a phrase from Kant. Thirdly, hospitality as a giving place. Derrida remarks, and I cite again from the remarkable seminar of his, that absolute hospitality requires that I open up my home and that I give access not only to the foreigner, provided with a family name, with the social status of being a foreigner and so forth, but to the absolute, unknown, anonymous other, and that I give place to them, that I let them come, that I let them arrive and take place in the place I offer to them. End of quote. It's precisely because of the inherent asymmetry, the alienation of the initial encounter of strangers, that some leeway, some open space has to be proffered by the person in charge. Let's call that person the hospitalizer, to the dispossessed or petitioning other, he or she who wishes to enter. In other words, some room for passage has to be allowed or provided to the entrant, the hospitalized, keeping in mind that the English word room is a linguistic cousin of German Raum, space. This is why the threshold always has to have a certain breadth, enough at least to step over or pass through. This breadth, as we saw earlier, entails place. Hence, we speak of the doorway across which movement is to be made. Way must be made, place given, if a stranger is to feel welcome, if a stranger is to become a guest. Fourthly, hospitality as edge. What gives place, more than a person or law or custom, is edge itself. It is edge that is the constant among the variables that we've been considering this morning. For there would be no act of hospitality without the ingredients of edges. their effective ingression into this act, whether these be the edges of gates or doors, bodies or cultures. The edge is where the action is. This is axiomatic for the enactment of hospitality. And here I mean edge not just as the point of intersection between pre-existing planes of intention, experience, and history, but edge as itself active. Let's call it edge making or edge work. This dynamic action is captured in an ordinary idiom, such as putting yourself on the line. Putting yourself on the line. Curiously, many acts of hospitality consist in just such an act, whose purport is precisely not positioning oneself on a literal laid out or laid down line, but rather taking a risk, however great or modest, by extending oneself beyond one's usual limits of energy or resources in order to take an extra, unprogrammed step beyond. A pas d'hospitalité, in short. This is the title of Derrida's text that captures just this sense of having to step forth from comfort and security to accomplish hospitality. The stepping out is not just that of the person with more authority or power in the circumstance, but that of both parties. They step, hospitalizer or hospitalized, toward each other, in and through an edge which their very convergence creates. This edge does not pre-exist, or if it does, in the case of a door or an established international border, it is reattested and retested every time it is recognized or resisted, being reconstituted by each act of legal traversal or illegal trespassing. The edge of hospitality is brought into being, or brought back into being, by the scene of hospitality itself, and thus it is always an event. Its being is a matter of becoming. The edge is continually made, unmade, or remade in the event of its happening. Hospitality, often seemingly so innocuous and so formal, is anything but established. Despite its ritualistic expressions and its roots in local or national tradition, and despite the stability of the architecture of the house or the wall that subtends it, it is something that occurs only at the extremities of existence, at the edges, as the edges. In fractalterity, in David Wood's suggestive term, about which we'll hear more a little later. Fractalterity. It occurs by acts of going out, acts of radical exteriorizing, thus of making oneself vulnerable in some sense. This vulnerability obtains both for guest and host, guard and border crosser, just in different degrees and formats. Such outgoingness is the very converse of the inwardizing that has been the great passion of the modern era. Go within, truth dwells in the inner man. St. Augustine's words are cited by Husserl, the last of the great philosophical modernists, and they are recited by Merleau-Ponty, who realized that the task had become the very converse of what Husserl intended. It was to go outside the confines of conscious subjectivity into the open of the lived world, where, as Merleau says, everything remains. Tout y demeure. This is a world of edges. It is the world on edge. Hospitality is the signal step in the enactment of this exteriorizing, for it entails the danger and the risk of being exposed to the other, however minimal, often however maximal. It is not necessarily the most dramatic form of such risk, that it contains all the basic elements of this exposure. Who is that at the door? Whom or what will I encounter when I open it? And I, the person who knocks, whom will I confront when the door is flung open? In neither case can I know in advance. In both, we are in the grip of the surprise of the event of hospitality. Just where Derrida and Levinas and Nancy, who wrote a remarkable article called The Surprise of the Event, Nancy. All these three thinkers in the wake of Husserl, that's where they take us quite explicitly. A stranger stood at the gates. This familiar line, which goes back, I found on Google, to a popular poem written in the 1930s by a certain Louis Sherrod. That line has lingered in the popular American imagination for a long time now. The stranger stood at the gates. Perhaps that's because of its stark juxtaposition of the two things that call for each other. Strangers, being unknown, call for gates, for some control and surveillance, some checking out or checking in on the part of whoever is in charge of the gates. In the original poem, this is Satan, who guards the gates to hell. What could be more predictable, what more natural than this, if strangers are presumed to be intruders and gatekeepers, or taken to be agents of law and order? Yet again, Stranger's Gate in Central Park suggests a different line of consideration. In its wide open state, this gate embodies a situation in which strangers, rather than being threats, as agents of disorder, are welcome, in which case gates need not be primarily defensive or exclusionary entities. Stranger's Gate suggests that gates can be the very vehicle of welcoming unknown others, whom they embrace and usher in unconditionally. Rather than regarding strangers and gates in an oppositional standoff with each other, Stranger's Gate encourages us to think of them as engaged in a collaborative enterprise that we might designate as a circumstance of open hospitality in that seemingly redundant English phrase, open hospitality. Concord then, rather than discord, of strangers and gates is indicated when we reflect on the fact that gates undergo two primary fates, not just keeping apart as with closed or heavily guarded gates, but also bringing together. Just as gate shows itself, the very term, idea, word gate, shows itself to possess two distinctly different semantic ranges, so stranger has a comparable ambiguity. On the one hand, a stranger is someone who is deeply alien to everything we have experienced and known, so much so that such a person is not merely foreign, but truly strange, so odd and incongruous as to upset any usual expectations we might have, even to threaten our personal integrity at some level. He's not one of us, we mutter under our collective breath, or proclaim in live voice if we are a Texas vigilante who spots a Mexicano who has slipped across the border. And then, in this inhospitable and suspicious spirit, we wish to exclude such a person from entry into our country, indeed our home, our neighborhood, or a part of the world. We feel uneasy, destabilized in the presence of the alien other. On the other hand, a stranger can be taken as other in a non-threatening sense, as just different, where this is construed as calling for curiosity, wanting to get better acquainted, even possibly to become friends at some point. Then we are moved to open the gates to the stranger forthwith, to welcome him or her through a passage that has become a genuine gateway, a porous edge that allows for ease of traversal rather than offering obstruction. We give place to the other. In that case, we give place to the other. The choice is stark. Either the stranger stands at guarded gates, or there is a stranger's gate. Either the stranger is stopped in his tracks, refused welcome, or the gate is the stranger's, being hers or his as much as the gatekeeper's. Now, between these two extremes, there are many intermediate cases. One of them is a situation where we act on the basis of a principle of universal hospitality of the sort which Kant posited, and which leads to the aporia posed by Kant's celebrated example of a killer at the door. Why should we admit someone vowed to murder the very person we're harboring in our home? Kant has no humanly satisfactory answer to this dilemma. It is one of those places where his cosmopolitanism leaves us entirely in the lurch. In contrast, there are local traditions of hospitality in which welcome is extended on carefully constructed conditional terms. You may come in if you are a Shiite, but not if you are a Sunni. This too is highly problematic, If Kant's position on hospitality is too unconditional, that of sectarian tradition is too dependent on strict group membership. Outside these two concrete dilemmas of hospitality, there loom many instances in which decisions to be hospitable or not are made for mainly pragmatic reasons, on the basis of what Kant would call counsels of prudence. But then we are left with a precariousness, if not the outright prejudice, of individual judgment, which is certainly not reliable across a broad spectrum of cases. Rather than trying to come up with a single correct ethical practice of hospitality, we are better advised, I believe, and I'm trying this thought out in this paper, to think of the situation of hospitality in terms of its edge character, that is, of strangers as at the edge of our domestic or national space, of gates as edges that can serve as boundaries or devolve into borders, and of ourselves, whether host or guest, guard or migrant, as on the edge ourselves, called to decide what to do whenever, and this is always, hospitality is at stake. In short, to own up to the fact that we're caught up in an unevadable circumstance in which diverse edges figure and reconfigure. Then at least, with that realization, we shall be clear as to the ingredients of this circumstance, even if we have no infallible guide as to how we should be acting in any given instance of it. We shall be at least descriptively honest, even if not ethically impressive or even consistent. And that may be, despite its undramatic appearance, a significant step forward, a step toward, un pas, vers, a step toward the understanding of hospitality as the enactment of an urgent edge game that concerns us at all times. Thank you. And now I think we're allowed, yeah, oh, well.
No, go ahead. I mean, would you take questions now?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to do, I think you can perhaps just call on people.
Thank
Yeah?
you.
Okay.
We're on the edge of whatever impressions we have of this paper, so yes, I would welcome this, but only briefly to allow the right time for David's paper. So reactions, responses, vitriolic thoughts. Yes?
Yeah, I kind of would like to question the category of open hospitality, specifically as you kind of bring it up in the Stranger's Gate, because it strikes me that if there's no control and there's no gatekeeper, there's nothing there. There's nothing to offer. So I mean, even if we look at it in a very kind of pragmatic way, if everyone's allowed in, eventually there's no one there to define the edge. So it's just strangeness in there. And how can you offer hospitality into strangeness?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the reason it intrigued me so much. When I first saw it, it was just a sense of paradox that you put better than I did. Yeah, it's, you know, it is at least, so let's try this another time, another way. It's a gesture toward hospitality that's occurring at two levels, architectural and collective. The city, which did establish the park, delegating some of that authority to the architects, Homestead and Vaux, is extending something like hospitality, and it's doing so by means of a certain kind of architectural gesture. So it's a gesture and it's collective, it's both, therefore collective as well as architectural. I wonder, you seem to indicate it's an empty gesture. Well, there is an edge. You do pass through it. It is a break in the wall. I can draw it. I did bring a slide. Interesting enough, in that particular case, unlike the other gates, and I think this is somewhat contingent on the topography of the western part, the western northern part of the park. No sooner do you walk through the gate, which is just a break in the wall, then you walk up stairs into the park, right up, very vertically. as if to say this is somewhat strenuous. But I'm not sure that's being said. I believe that really was contingent. My guess is that the Stranger's Gate might have been anywhere else in the park, although it is interesting it's on the west side rather than the east side. But leaving that, that's secondary symbolism and only speculative. The basic question is, you know, is the situation offering hospitality or not? Does it really fit at all, you know, into the paradigm or thought of, you know, what hospitality consists in? For me, it does precisely because of its extremity. It's being unconditional, it's always being open. I'm a night creature, so I walk in the park at night, and so I walk in and out of that place, you know, I've had a lot of time since I noticed it, although it took me 2 years to actually see this inconspicuous set of 2 words chiseled in to the lower wall. So the wall itself, which is only that high, you know. It's a wall that's not a wall, just like this is a gate that's not a gate. So the whole thing is actually a kind of curiously sublimated expression of what in other circumstances would be fiercely gate-like and guarded, and yes, would have people and dogs and sensors, as at La Frontera, and drones, you see, and 24-hour cameras. It's very, very opposite. I've been spending some time in Nogales in recent years, and so, you know, the difference was just completely shocking to me between these 2 circumstances. So I admit, I'm taking it as an asymptote. I'm just taking it as an extremity. To me, it's not an empty gesture. It's like pointing to a possibility of open hospitality. I admit I'm using that term here almost literally, but the whole paper is an exercise in literalism. You know, how far can you press the notion of edge, which most of the time, for most of us, you know, really starts with physical edges. And then we metaphorize it, but still, you know, edge is one of those words that clings tenaciously to its origin as edges of things and places. It's just kind of curious itself. So I just wanted to kind of bracket that and move, I admit, in that term open hospitality. Partly I was just quoting. We use the phrase kind of idly. Maybe I was too, open hospitality. But you're giving me something to think about. I should have been more clear about the extremity of the case. Maybe it's so extreme that it doesn't actually fit into anything else I'm discussing, except on the other side, you know, on the other side of the limit. But then it still can illuminate by its very difference, you see, by its oddity. It is called Stranger's Gate. And I take those, you know, being a literalist, I take words seriously. And so, yes, there are several questions here. I think this gentleman, Richard, this lady, yes, in that sequence, and a couple of others. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was interested. It seems there's a wish to assimilate the notion of the stranger, the notion of the foreigner. And I'm interested in the extent to which those 2 are not the same thing. Because it seems to me that the foreigner is a production of a structure of inclusion and exclusion. It's a political structure, if you will. And I'm wondering whether that model can really do justice to the various ways in which we're strange to each other and to ourselves. So it's a question of priority in a certain way. I wonder how far you assimilate those 2.
Yeah, well, it really does lead to a vast study that I'm not really quite prepared to make, and which Kristeva has done so well in Strangers to Ourselves that you know, I don't want to repeat her analysis here. I mean, she would agree with you that Strangers are richer, semantically, you know, more multiple in its character. Foreigners easier to win country, and you know, we tend to close down upon it much more easily, whereas Stranger, because it ends up in as the root of estrangement and things of that kind, we can really run with it more fully, as Kristeva does in that book. concluding, of course, that ultimately, the strangest strangeness is the way that we're strangers to ourselves, as in the title of the book. So this is very interesting, and comes doubtless from Lacan and Freud, in some sense, from their sense, that we're internally unknown to ourselves. So, yeah, well, thank you for emphasizing the difference. I agree with it. They're not on the same level, and the paper acted as if they were. They're not. It's true. Strangers the richer, I think, term, as Richard Carney knows, and he had the next question, so maybe he's going to ask about this.
Well,
strangers, gods, monsters, yes?
Mine is actually a very practical question, and coming back to the limit cases, I'm just wondering, to take a topical instance, if the stranger at the gate, at the stranger's gate, happens to have swine flu, right? What
oh my God!
Don't
say it.
As Tolstoy would say, what is to be done? And in the language of your wonderful paper, the question of the risk of vulnerability you mentioned at one point, exposure to the stranger.
Yeah.
When it comes to something very practical like this, can one even invoke the notion of, the gate that's always open, unconditional or pure or absolute hospitality?
Mm.
Because it's a tricky one. I mean, don't we need to discriminate? And discriminate means two things in two senses. Don't we need to invigilate? And yet a viral flu is something that doesn't respect borders or frontiers, and that provokes a lot of hysteria, for instance, in the media, where people are dying more of ordinary flu than swine flu. But there's something about the pure and the impure, the inside and the outside, that actually frightens the imagination. And I think as a second example, Dorothy Day's huge dilemma in her hospitality house. It's open to everyone, but she had this anxiety when she's letting in homeless people that need to be fed and nourished on the one hand, and battered wives. She also runs the risk of opening the door to child molesters and rapists. And as she says, when do I know that the stranger is Christ or is a psychopath? And she says, we never really do. It's kind of an endless hermeneutic wager.
Which is what Derrida really says about unconditional hospitality. So he there is very close to Dorothy Day, and Dorothy Day then in a certain way provides for us, kind of exemplar of unconditional hospitality, or taking it as far toward that as seems humanly possible, or in any case in our society has been done, and therefore has ethical exemplarity built into it, because of course most of us, most of the time, you're right, are very guarded, very conditional, and we are mortally afraid of anything crossing over, the transom, the open transom, like flu virus. I suspect that in this particular case, since there's already so much vexation at the border and so much unresolved thinking about immigration and issues of that kind, not to mention the drug cartels and recent violence, that this just reinforces an already existing tendency to hold those people down there in that part of the world guilty, responsible, and they should be quarantined, not only for the virus, that becomes a medical excuse for doing what we're already doing to them, of course, in so many ways, politically and militarily, so, and economically, starting with the latter. So I don't know, I'm very suspicious of it, like you are. Still, the basic phenomenological fear is deep, and there is, I sensed on the plane last night, a lot of uneasiness, people sort of looking around at their neighbors to see if they might be, a little on the weak side, a little bit infected, a little set back.
A little Mexican.
Or maybe a little Mexican. Right. So, you opened, Richard, I have no answer to it. You opened a very difficult issue, what about something invisible, intangible, that does move back for the cross borders without our being able to check it, not directly anyway. It's a complex question, actually. You bring in the medical dimension, which I agree should be explored. Medical hospitality, very interesting, actually. And it raises the issue of paranoia, and matters of that kind, political paranoia that I think it reinforces in this particular case of La Frontera. So, wish I had an answer to it, but now we're continuing. I believe the next was a person here, and then yourself, and yes.
I think we probably have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
We can
try to be brief if you could. This is only the first paper, keep in mind. And Simon Critchley has just arrived. Welcome, Simon. Right. Yes.
Thank you for your paper. This actually made some sense to me also about the way that you use Derrida's account of hospitality. I like the way that you use the gate as a metaphor, and I want to try to press the limits of that a little bit. My own concerns are, well, I mean, I am one of Richard's students, so I am kind of recurring on one hand, and on the other hand, I try to do work in Latin American studies. So, for me as a person of mixed identity, what I found somewhat troubling about the metaphor is that it tended to externalize or put the limits of hospitality on the outside. And as I recall so many of my own family in Mexico and how they act about things, there's a mixed heritage in Mexico, particularly with the legacy of Spain and post-colonialism. And there's a real way in which most Mexicans, particularly, are mestizo, as I myself am. And there's a need then in which you need, for one to understand a kind of strangeness along the Christadian line as internal, how hospitality is something not directed only to people outside and away from us, but something equally directed towards the inside.
Yes.
And I'm not too sure how the gate metaphor really addressed these things at all, but the spatial dimensions of it seemed entirely to be of another kind, and I wondered if this account wasn't assumed by the metaphor that you took out.
Yeah, I mean, a number of you now have been questioning this. I mean, that's where I started, and so it's true. I kind of beat it to death, as philosophers tend to do, whatever they pick up, concept, word. Yeah, maybe this is the limit of it. I don't know what to say. I mean, there aren't a lot of philosophical reflections on gates, so that's where I decided to go part of it because it hadn't been done. Not even Derrida goes there, so I just thought, well, let's go with gate for this talk. But maybe I went too far. I don't know. And maybe there is a limit. I love your notion of an internal hospitality. Of course, I did rather externalize, and that's part of my general point about why the issue of hospitality has come up in recent years as part of the general tendency that David Wood calls exteriorizing toward the fractal edge of things. You're about to hear this, and I think it's part of that. I'm actually writing a separate book on the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, that will explore some of these questions, so I'd love to talk with you more about this, because I'm vexed by it, I'm angry about it, and I'm trying to figure it out as we speak. But thank you. One last question?
One last quick one.
Well, there are a number of hands up, so I can't really, I don't know what to say. Maybe since you were such a genial host,
well,
you can have the last question.
That's very kind of you. I have another practical question.
Yeah.
And this has to do with the kinds of gates that I think we all encounter all the time. Not the, I'm not talking about checkpoints and those sorts of things. Yeah. The gates that we encounter, particularly in the university, right? The fact that we're all doorkeepers and gatekeepers of traditions, for instance. And that hospitality, more often than not, is in a confrontation with tradition and transmission of tradition.
Yeah.
And the way in which most of us feel excluded or included, it's more often than not has to do with the kind of discourses that we speak and engage in.
Yes.
It's really quite easy to sort of admit a foreigner, so to say, into a physical space.
Yeah. That's
very easy, but the difficulty usually lies in admitting someone who speaks a different kind of a discourse.
Yes.
Right, and I'm particularly interested in this because I'm in the English department, and I'm sort of interested in the kind of work that people in philosophy, such as yourself, do. Yeah. What would hospitality, unconditional hospitality, actually mean? What really? I mean, besides all the the platitudes about interdisciplinarity, etc.
Yeah.
You know, what is that edge of
Yeah.
of hospitable discourse?
You know, I really think suddenly as you speak, I realize something about my own discipline, which is that, you know, we are in principle devoted, this is a Socratic matter. Is not Socrates supposed to be someone who took on anyone and anything, any idea, right? It doesn't matter what specialty you come from, medical, you know, rhetorical, sophistical, political, you know, think of it. And in a certain way, we all fail at this as philosophers, but I mean, in principle, we like to think that we sort of take or can take anything on. So in that sense, we are unconditionally hospitable. Within the, of course, as Derrida would hasten to add, within the limits of the university, the classroom, the decorum of the classroom. Once that's, you know, this is our equivalent of the agora, once that's established, then in a curious way, we can be infinitely open, you see, to any challenge, any skepticism.
But there's a demand for translation, right? I mean, thinking about what Derrida says and about translation in
Yes.
the hospitality book, and that's the first violence, he says.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe a one-sentence comment on that would be better.
Yeah.
Suspend it for now.
Well, that's such a vast issue. I don't think I can give a one-sentence comment, but it's a very good point. That Socratic optimism, what Nietzsche called Socrates, you know, theoretical optimism, was perhaps misplaced, or in any case, it was only a regulative ideal at best. In practice, as you say, it's hedged about, you know, enormously with problems of translation, yes, and cultural difference, and the rest. So, you know, I don't know how to pursue it any longer, except I still believe in it. You know, I don't know what to do except to try to practice it. Okay, thank you.
Professor David Wood is Joe B. White Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. His interests lie in the possibilities of reading and thinking opened up by contemporary continental philosophy and by 19th century German thought. His current philosophical projects include reworking, displacing Heidegger's treatment of time within fundamental ontology, developing a non-prescriptive post-humanistic approach to ethics, providing an account of truth that does justice both to its normative, existential, and metaphysical dimensions, various different approaches to the philosophy of nature, environmental philosophy, animal rights, thinking boundaries, etc. But the most interesting thing about Professor Wood is that he runs a series of philosophy talks at the Nashville Downtown Public Library. And he's also an environmental artist and stages art events from time to time. Most of you know that he's the author of numerous works, including Time After Time, Step Back, Thinking After Heidegger, Philosophy at the Limit, The Deconstruction of Time. Whoops, I think I'm running out of time here. It's a very long list. And he's also, of course, edited over a dozen books and is the author of hundreds of articles. Professor Wood.
Thanks very much. Is this yes? I can't start really without thanking Richard for inviting me and congratulating him on this wonderful series, which I guess we're the sort of culmination of the whole of this semester. I really wish I could have been attending the rest of it. And then I would also just like to say how interesting it is to have been invited here as a guest. And I'm thinking, I'm not from this country, and I came here about 14 years ago. And like everyone, I'm trying to figure out who I am. I'm a bit of a stranger to myself, like all of us. And I was reminded of, just while Ed was talking, of Sartre's description in Saint-Genet of Genet trying to figure out who he was in this, I guess, orphanage. And he's reaching for a cookie, the top shelf, and the, I guess the boss comes in, the matron, and says, Jenny, you're a thief. And he's so excited because he didn't know who he was. And now he knows he's a thief. Well, I was actually on the Mexican border, and it's like 16 miles from the border, just outside El Paso a few years ago, driving along, and this police car stopped me and my kids, and demanded my driving license and so on. You know, I hadn't shaved for a while, but I looked pretty white. And so he took my driving license and he sort of put it through his stuff, and he said to me, he came back, he's a big guy, you know, big hat, cigar. He says, "You're an alien." And I thought, you know, that really helps. I was looking for something to hold on to, like Jenny and the thief. Now I know who I am. So I was very grateful to that guy. But I was thinking about, you know, Richard inviting me here, and you know, Richard being from another country, not from England, is that right? From and here we are. He invited me. You know, he's an alien, inviting me, a resident, an alien. I'm not sure whether alien resident or resident alien, to come and to Boston, where we had that little misunderstanding with tea a while back. And I'm thinking, this is how do you deconstruct this extraordinary kind of role and complex here, where you have, as you were, a guest. Richard's a guest. We can be kicked out. One small felony, and we're out of here. You know that? I mean, straight out. So I won't tell them. Now, you know, a guest inviting a guest. So this whole thing really is all tied up with hospitality from the beginning. Well, this paper is entitled "Things at the Edge of the World," and it starts out. I'm talking like this because I'm going to try and cut it back a bit as I present it. It starts out with some reflections on the fascinating title of Heidegger's essay, "What is a Thing?" and in which Heidegger talks about a jar, or a jug, and tries to amplify this, for instance, the space in which that jug is to be found, and opens up, if you like, the world of the jug, the pouring and the drinking and so on. And also his essay, "What is on the Origin of a Work of Art," in which he sees a work of art also as itself opening up a world. And I start out a bit like this because it strikes me that we could sort of generalize Heidegger's approach here and come up with a rather sort of weird thought, which is the possibility that the world, as we call it, may be populated with beings that in all kinds of ways open worlds, open onto worlds, open our eyes to possible worlds. When Alice ventured into the rabbit hole, she discovered a world within a world. I'm proposing the world be viewed as a veritable rabbit warren in which the entrances to these other worlds are marked by what we call things. To enter into a thing in this way would be to open up the world or worlds into which it invites us. Conceived in this way, things are marked by analogues of what physicists call event horizons. This is the point or line in which, or the edge in which we switch from seeing the thing as in the world to seeing the thing as projecting or opening or proliferating its own world, its own order of things. Now this structure of switching or reversal is found by Levinas in my coming up against the limit of my own intentional orientation. It's interruption by the face or appeal or call of the other itself, putting a strange reversed spin on Sartre's account of the effect of the look. This structure of switching you can also find in Rilke's description of the experience of being looked at by a tree, or the self-disgust that D.H. Lawrence feels after throwing a stick at a snake. In each case, a thing that begins as an object of experience becomes the site of an event of reversal and transformation, in which not only am I implicated in an unexpected way, but the rest of the world is poised for restructuration and the proliferation of new chains of possibility. Now, in the extended project for which this paper is merely a trailer, Things at the Edge of the World, this outlines what I call a truly fractal ontology. The world is no longer a collection of things, it's rather a space that enables spaces, a time proliferating times. And things come to be seen as events, sites for transformation. I want to give today a kind of introduction to this project by working through a few examples. And I will locate the stranger, and indeed recurrent productive strangeness, within this account. So I'm going to give you, start out with an example, that of the sun. Thing up there. It's a remarkable fact that this source of so much light is dangerous to direct sight. We may understand that danger physiologically, that we may burn the retina. But there's another danger of a quite different order, that we may see something new and disturbing, something other than what was blindingly obvious. The sun as the source of all energy, of our sustained existence, and so on. For those of us wedded to autonomy, this may be an unwelcome reminder of dependency. And for those who have come to embrace a transcendent deity, the tantalizingly ambivalent status of the sun as both an item of furniture in the heavens and the energetic ground of our being might well cause a ripple of unease, at least in the decision to have abandoned sun worship. Maybe for all their barbaric practices, the Aztecs were onto something. Might not sun worship be a profound practice of meditation on the deep significance of the sun and all things solar? And there's more to come. When we look at the sun, it's true. The sun does not look back. This gives us a certain assurance of privilege. And yet, think about our eyes. What are they? They're the evolutionary product of living on an earth flooded with light for millions of years. These things I call my eyes spring from the sun, as does every animate organism. What looks at the sun is a child of sunlight. This is true of me as a living being and of my eyes, as essentially attuned to the sun and the visibility it opens up. Now, it's easy for phenomenologists to think of the constitutive in a formal way or a transcendental way, but it's importantly material and historical. The event of reversal or fracture is one in which the eye or I that sees the God or the sun comes to grasp it further as the condition of its own capacity to see at all, indeed to be at all. We may confidently surmise that this is an event with legs, one that ushers in further developments. Such a dependency has what I call ter-existential implications. What would it be like to welcome such a revelation, or to refuse it? What would it be, as Nietzsche asked with regard to eternal return, to will it? Consider for a moment one of the deepest and most difficult aspects of this dependency, our being tied up in an unthinkably deep past. The time of evolution, of life, of animal life, of human life, is unthinkably deep. Both because it exceeds our capacity to imagine, just in terms of scale, raising really interesting questions about what those limits are and what we mean by imagine. Can we imagine the Big Bang? I just pause so that you could do that. Or the end of the world. Imagine the end of the world. But beyond the question of magnitude, we must also imagine our not being here, and indeed there being nothing like us on the planet, either at the beginning or the end. We have to peer back an interminably long way around the evolutionary corners that block illumination from the distant past. But exploring the temporal aspects of our dependency on the sun has only just begun. A meditation on this opening soon realizes that our entire fossil fuel economy and way of life consists in releasing at an accelerating rate the reserves of solar energy locked up in gas, oil, and coal, burning it like there's no tomorrow. We're tapping our stored solar past as well as drinking in today's light and heat. Moreover, we know that one day the sun will explode and the experiment will come to an end. That's not a philosophical claim, that's just a bit of science. The second example, starting after the sun, is the non-human animal. I mentioned Lawrence's poem, The Snake, in which he laments his reactive violence, throwing a stick at the snake. You should also think of Aldo Leopold's account of the light in the dying wolf's eyes, or Rothko's basking lizard to whom he says the stone terrace belongs. The movement, the reversal, the transformation is one in which the animal moves from being a part of my world, our world, to making a claim, to occasioning, on my part, the recognition the animal too, in some sense, has a world, projects significant dwelling. Some such experience happens when I pick up a worm crossing the path after a rain and deposit it safely on the other side. I recognize both vulnerability and something of a manner of life or way of dwelling on the part of the worm. In modest fashion, I go out of my way, as we say, to help him on his way. Something happens here, but it's mostly an accommodation of one mode of life to another. There's no threat from the worm, and he never looks back. The reversal hasn't yet happened, we're still on the cusp. The reversal here has many portals. We notice the spider's web, or the beaver's dam, or my ex-hunting friend recalls we watch squirrels playing on a tree trunk. In each case, a concept appears on the other side of the line: home, territory, play, and we are primed for something abrupt to happen. Another friend's advice on encountering wasps is apposite here. Never make eye contact, and they won't sting you. It took me a while to realize this was a joke. But this possibility of eye contact, of seeing oneself being looked at, takes us closer to the edge. The reversal happens when we see ourselves being seen, and then that we don't really understand how they see us, and then that we're as much a part of their world, whatever that is, as they of ours. This reversal, through an encounter with the other than human, can come in ways that are all too clear. Sartre's account of the look has this abruptness about it. But being the object of the other's gaze is no mystery. In the movie Grizzly Man, Timothy Treadwell loses his life when he and his girlfriend are finally eaten by a rogue bear after 13 seasons of peaceful coexistence in Alaska. The director, Werner Herzog, comments that Treadwell just didn't get it. The bears saw him as food. And when he was eaten, he became part of their world in a very literal sense. This suggests not that bears have no as such, as Heidegger might say, but that their version, at the very least, even if it overlaps our own, may distribute value differently. But in some ways, this reversal is still too straightforward, a bit like, man bites dog, hunter hunted, and so on. The true reversal would come were this path of thinking to converge eventually with the path of what is metaphysics, where Heidegger speaks of the totality of what is slipping away from us in angst, dread. It's the point at which we are reminded of the unheimlich at the heart of our dwelling. The animal I'm suggesting has this power, the non-human animal, to relieve us of our habituated dwelling by bringing us face to face with a significantly different and unassimilable mode of dwelling. Third case I want to take is that of the other human, and here I'll divide the example into three: the sexual other, the stranger, and the enemy. Now that obviously the textual ghosts floating in the background are Irigaray, Levinas with Derrida, and Carl Schmitt. Each of these relations marks the site of a radical transformation, for it's open to such a possibility. And in pursuing these three cases of the sexual other, the stranger, and the enemy, I'll be able, I think, to differentiate my position from one centered on the specifically ethical opening. I a little quote in there: "The sense of wonder is the mark of the philosopher," from Plato's Theaetetus. Consider first the sexual other, and Irigaray's insistence that the experience of wonder properly applies to the sexual other before it applies to the cosmos, thus upending any impersonal metaphysical primacy of wonder. Irigaray in particular alludes to Descartes' account of wonder as the first passion, being moved by our first encounter with a thing before we know what it is, which is very interesting in relation to the idea of pure hospitality. She asks that we return this feeling of wonder, surprise, and astonishment in the face of the unknowable to its proper place, the realm of sexual difference, by which, somewhat traditionally, she means the difference between man and woman. For Irigaray, wonder is the antidote to any claim to possess or control the other. How does this account fit into my schema? Wonder or astonishment is the experience that arrests and reverses. And it's not the only experience, like I hesitate to say. It's an experience that arrests and reverses the everyday possessive projective orientation of the sexual other, allowing us to treat and see the other as something of a miraculous compliment, as if for the first time. Here it's not that the other looks back with a recrystallizing impact that Sartre, say, described in the gaze. Rather, a space of non-possessive delight is opened up. Irigaray goes on to nominate angels as inaugurating and protecting sexual encounter, that celebration beyond any master-slave drama of domination. Another little quote that's landed in the text here: Dasein is the happening of strangeness, from Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics. Dasein is the happening of strangeness. For the second encounter with the human other, I take the example of the stranger, with an eye to Levinas's focus on the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, and Derrida's meditations on hospitality. In the stranger, three different dimensions at least come together. First, the absence of knowledge. I know nothing about this person, whether they're to be trusted, whether they're well disposed, or what. Second, that this stranger's in need, being away from home. And thirdly, you're unlikely to meet this person again. The appearance of a stranger may occasion no response. Just drive on by, or you don't answer the door, or a negative response, turning down their visa application. Such responses would confirm a certain default self-centeredness. But there's also the possibility of the event in which I'm taken out of myself, and even moved to the point of what Derrida calls pure hospitality, a welcome without limit, without checking credentials, in which I put myself, my house, my family, my country, fundamentally at risk. I see myself then as hostage to the other without any consideration of reciprocity. The scales of native narcissism fall from my eyes, and I'm exposed to the need of the other. I discover saintliness. Well, I'm going to leave out reference to the enemy just for sake of time. To this list, lover, stranger, enemy, we could add the friend, the master, the ghost, many others. The list goes on. In each case, the category of the other can emerge or subside without reason. And by such a transformation, the world is each time transfigured. The point of supplying these various examples, worked and unworked, is to demonstrate that the phenomenon of renewal and transformation in the self-other relation is far from being restricted to the charismatically ethical cases of the other in need, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And the reason for this, I think, provides an ontological ground even for those privileged ethical cases, which I think undermines Levinas's claim that ethics is first philosophy. Let me just explore this thought in the next section. I've described things at the edge of the world as sites at which events of reversal and transformation take place, and that the world opened up by this whole analysis is one of fractal time and space, one in which things turn out not just to furnish our world, but as open invitations to pass over into other worlds, rabbit holes. Focusing on the worlds these things open up takes us away from what we might call subjectivity. And yet, issues of that order are clearly still at stake. These reversals all seem to involve a change in the direction of intentionality. Even if one wants to promote a fractal world, a space and time of discontinuous regions, one has to concede that access to such worlds is regulated by what we might call the fluency of selfhood. All too quickly, so I just want to say why I think this and why it matters. I suggests that the entire domain marked by these events of reversal and so on is generated by the combined operation of three different phenomena. First, the primordial constitution of selfhood. Second, variable modes of identification with that self. And third, the projection of modes of otherness consistent with one's manner of self-relatedness. We might describe these events as all involving counter-projection, perhaps a cousin of the hypoche, in which we cease our thetic possessiveness and allow ourselves to be guided creatively by what we might call play spaces. I'm imagining here a generalization of Gadamer's sense of entering the space opened up by a work of art. But our analysis can take another direction. If the shapes taken by this self-other relation are such as to fortify a primordially constituted self, the question remains, from what material, with what ingredients is such selfhood constituted? I don't want to suggest anything very new here, except to say, and I think here both Bill and Ed would approve of this, that philosophers and phenomenologists need to take more regularly on board that this fundamental matrix of self was constitutively relational from the beginning. It's not as if we start out with this self that is somehow just one thing. So what does it mean to say that it's constitutively relational from the beginning? Well, by this I mean some really simple things, but somehow I'm saying I think we need to keep them in play. That there's no getting away from the original drama in which a human infant arrives on this earth utterly dependent on others to satisfy its absolute needs, especially hunger and sociality. The sight of such needs is not yet a self, but we must suppose that the shape in which such needs are met or frustrated will begin to constitute selfhood, laying down ground-level assumptions about whether and how quickly the world responds to my expressed needs, providing an original formatting to rhythms of desire and satiation and expectations about my ability through social interaction to affect these outcomes. To put it really bluntly, does a breast appear when I need it? That's got to be the question that the really young infant is asking. As I see it, the manner and the upshot of these transformative reversals has to do with whether and how the original material of self-constitution, my pre-reflexive formative relations with my early caregiver, mother, let's say, whether these are enabling or disabling. Let me give an example. It appears that for decades, exposing the bodies of pregnant women, by bodies I don't mean dead bodies, I mean, living bodies, was actually banned under the code from American movies. That's the production code. It's been suggested that this is because of the implied sexuality that it betrays. If you see a pregnant woman, you know she's had sex. Unless it, I know it's the Catholic place, not necessary.
Certain exceptions.
Like normally. So having just been married with nothing else. But it seems to be just as likely to betray an original anxiety that we men, especially, who are trained as autonomous beings, find it difficult to acknowledge ontological dependency. I came from a woman. Well, we all do. And yet this dependency is fundamental. The question is whether and how we acknowledge it. Wittgenstein declares that man is an essentially dependent being, and then adds, and that on which we depend, we may call God. Well, we may, or we may not. Irigaray clearly sees that as a displacement of a primary passion whose proper place is the sexual other. Melanie Klein, on the other hand, would see the religious as a displaced refusal to acknowledge the constitutive role of mother. And this refusal is understandable if we lack the means adequately to conceptualize the event or process of self-formation at that early time. If, that is, we insist there must be a self from the beginning to act on. I'm claiming that the domain of these topological transformations and reversals is itself made accessible or available to us to the extent that we have some sort of affective access to the grounds of our own selfhood, one which is compatible with dependency, or more specifically, constitutive relationality. Now, in a way that will take us full circle, back to the sun and to the animal, I want to end with another case of reversal, one on a par with the Copernican revolution, and one with both individual and collective significance. Throwing a banana skin out the car window, pumping effluent into the river, tossing all the old magazines, even trying to forget one's old girlfriends, or filing away random papers under miscellaneous, all have one thing in common: their acts of faith in the power of a way. A way used to be a place from which things and people did not come back. We throw them away. Gone. For the English, the rot set in when the convicts we sent to Australia returned to beat us at cricket. But right across the board these days, away is not playing ball. We throw things away, but the landfills are full. We pump effluent into the river, and drinking water downstream doesn't taste as good as it did. What used to be a straight line has become a circle, indeed a Möbius strip. We still throw things away, but the other side of the strip is continuous with this side. This is a fundamental schematic reversal, a dramatic shift in the shape of world relationality. The nurturing, sustaining world can no longer guarantee its capacity to play that role. Our toxic activity is affecting the Earth's capacity to nurture and sustain us. That this could be happening is a major threat to a certain sense of our freedom and agency, one I think that was perhaps always mistaken. The transformative events that erupt with a meditation on the sun, or on the animal, or on the earth, would help us flesh out an evolutionary story of our constitution as humans, coupled with the developmental story that I proposed very quickly, which could be opened by a meditation on mother or breast or infant, more things, as it were. And we have the ingredients for a story of deep material constitutive relationality, one which would doubtless disturb the traditional poise of our autonomous agency. The next question, one of ethical significance, is the sense proposed by Heidegger in his letter on humanism, would be whether and how we could will, that is, performatively embody, a self-understanding in which we are essentially processual, embodied beneficiaries of the evolutionary adventure, in a way that preserves rather than tries to assimilate the strangeness of all that. This scenario of fractal alterity, as I'm calling it, would replace that of homogeneous space, either in the sense of my world laid out before me, or that of a single space in which all world holders find their place. The world of fractal alterity is one that cannot be properly represented, but rather primes us to expect displacements, reversals, and transformations. It's in this world that strangers, gods, and monsters properly flourish, not crowded onto the same stage as at the end of a play, but as various manners of world opening, mobilizing, as I've said, the deepest resources by which our selfhood is constituted. Without for a moment putting in question the ethical significance of those events of self-displacement that Levinas highlights, my claim is that the capacity to break out of primary narcissism is not itself specifically ethical, but ontological, and shared by events in which imagination, aesthetic adventure, erotic delight are at the center stage, rather than any ethical engagement. The stranger may well be in need, demanding the bread from my mouth, but he may equally, as with the stranger of Plato's sophist, quoted by Heidegger at the beginning of Being in Time, disconcert us, question us, announce the unheimlich, and call on me to set out with him on a dangerous and disturbing path. What I'm proposing could be seen as radicalizing the move in being and time from a metaphysics of subjectivity to one based on constitutive world relationality, radicalizing that move. But the version of being in the world that I'm adumbrating here is one of, as I said, fractal heritage, in which we are essentially exposed to manifold ways of world making, to alien avenues, to portals of possibility. Through wonder, perhaps also through horror and disgust or disappointment, we may find our friend or lover or nation to be the strangest thing, or indeed, as Christeva mentioned, as Ed mentioned with reference to Christeva, ourselves. Heidegger provides a rich resource, in particular his reading of Sophocles' Antigone, the first chorus of which begins, "There is much that is strange, there is nothing that surpasses man in strangeness." Heidegger will pretty much translate these thoughts into his own language, naming death as that strange and alien, unheimlich thing that banishes us once and for all from everything in which we are at home. Man is always, and I quote again, and essentially without issue in the face of death. His Dasein is the happening of strangeness. And death, indeed, is perhaps the key thing at the edge of the world. Almost done. Against Levinas, I continue to press the idea that the ethical version of expropriation via the demand of the other is not fundamental. I suggested earlier that I had doubts about infinite obligation, that it's perhaps a misunderstanding. Why do I say this? The structure of being invited, seduced, made demands of, challenged by something which exceeds any representation is not limited to ethical demand. Indeed, it captures quite well the lure of the thing, which in projecting a world defies representation in any other world in which it is merely furniture. One could say that in the humility required to acknowledge such an access, that we can't simply draw this thing into our world and there it is, we've got it all, but that requires a certain kind of humility. There's an ethical opening, right there. But it would equally apply to death, to a work of art, to God, or to the sun, as to the human other in need. The idea of the infinitely demanding has a heroic cast to it. Derrida will ask how he can justify feeding his cat and not all the other hungry cats in the world. And that if one thought one could calculate one's obligation, one would have reduced it to an algorithm, a rule, and in effect be guilty of pursuing a good conscience. Let me try to tease apart this bundle of thoughts in which a number of strands are woven tightly together. First, there's the idea that my obligation is unrepresentable. Second, that this obligation arises through a radical, absolute schematic reversal, in which the other is now at the center of the universe. And thirdly, that this relation to the other is asymmetrical, in the sense that there can be no relation to or dealing with any demand I might be thought to make on the other. As I see it, however, the weaving together of these strands leads to a heroic misunderstanding. The reversal of perspective, decentering self-concern, is absolute, in the sense that the Copernican revolution was an absolute. Being the center, or on the other hand, rotating around the center, are topological options between which there's no compromise.